Sir, we need to speak with you.
What's this about? Just a routine check. Please cooperate.
Thank you,
I've
sir.
been sitting quietly the entire flight.
He's been staring and writing things down. I don't think he should be in first class.
My boarding pass is
Reported
right
making
here.
the crew uncomfortable.
And sitting quietly the entire flight.
He's been staring and writing things down. I don't think he should be in first class.
My boarding pass is right
I
here.
need security up here. Seat 3A.
Sir, please stand up and place your hands behind your back.
What charge?
I'll sort that out on the ground.
I need security up here. Seat 3A.
Sir, please stand up and place your hands behind your back.
For what charge?
We'll sort that out on the ground.
The terminal at Chicago O'Hare was already humming with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday morning. Gate 14B had the particular energy of a full flight, passengers cramming roller bags into overhead bins, children already restless, business people with laptops open before the seatbelt signs had even been announced. Coffee cups were being refilled at the nearby kiosk. A family of 4 argued quietly about window versus aisle. Gate agents worked the desk with the practiced speed of people permanently behind schedule. And somewhere inside all of it, moving through the jetway with the kind of quiet, unhurried efficiency that comes from years of operating in environments far more dangerous than a commercial flight cabin, was Senior Chief Marcus Vance. He was wearing dark jeans, a fitted navy Henley, and clean white sneakers. His carry-on was a mid-sized black duffel, military-grade nylon, the kind that does not collapse when you set it down hard. No monogram, no airline tags from previous trips. He wore no uniform, no rank insignia, nothing on his body that would tell a stranger who he was or what he had spent 16 years doing. There was nothing about him, to an untrained eye, that would suggest he had deployed to 4 combat zones, survived engagements that will never appear in any public record, earned 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, and that the duffel on his shoulder contained official travel orders stamped by the Department of Defense and a classified document pouch sealed after a NATO intelligence briefing in Stuttgart, Germany, a briefing he had attended not as support staff but as a principal. He was returning those documents to a secure facility in Washington. The Pentagon had booked his ticket. The flight was the least complicated part of his week. He boarded early, government priority boarding, and walked the length of the first-class cabin without pausing, without looking around the way tourists do, without the vague performance of importance that business travelers often put on in the first few rows. He moved like someone who has spent his adult life entering rooms and immediately understanding them. Seat 3A. Window seat. Left side of the aircraft. He had chosen it when his travel coordinator booked the ticket, the same way he always chose seats. Sightline to the entrance, back to the hull, minimum exposure. Not paranoia. Habit. The kind of habit burned in over 16 years of working in spaces where inattention had consequences that were permanent and final. He slid the duffel into the overhead bin with one hand, latched it shut, sat down, and ordered water from the boarding attendant without looking up from the motion. He pulled a worn paperback from the front pocket of the duffel before he stowed it, a novel he had been reading in 4-page increments since Stuttgart, and within 2 minutes of sitting down he was in it, absorbed, looking for all the world like the simplest possible version of a passenger on a domestic flight. He was 38 years old. He had survived things the people around him could not name and would not believe. A 90-minute flight to Dulles was, by any honest measure, the easiest thing he would do all week. He had no reason to think that was about to change. That was when Ashley Pruitt first looked at him. She was 8 months into her career as a flight attendant for Continental Meridian Airlines. 8 months of classroom certification, 4 months of supervised line flying, and somewhere inside those 12 cumulative months she had developed what her colleagues would later describe, very carefully, in their official statements, with the particular caution of people who understood they were being recorded, as a heightened sensitivity toward certain passengers. Ashley was 26 years old. She was efficient in the galley and reliably pleasant in the cabin. Her third-month performance review praised her hospitality instincts and noted a confident communication style. What no review had captured yet, because it had not yet been fully tested, was the edge beneath the pleasantry. The willingness to move on a feeling before the feeling had been grounded in anything observable. She looked at Marcus Vance in 3A, the way you look at something that does not match the picture you have already assembled for a space. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, and almost unnervingly still. Not the stillness of exhaustion or boredom, the particular active stillness of someone paying close attention to their surroundings without appearing to do so. His eyes moved in intervals from the page to the boarding door and back. Measured, regular. She would later describe this to investigators as rhythmic and deliberate, as if he were tracking the crew. She had no way of knowing that what she was watching was a trained threat assessment pattern, the same unconscious sweep that Marcus Vance ran automatically in every enclosed environment he entered. A reflex developed over a career spent in rooms where the door was the only thing that mattered, and a single distracted moment could cost you everything and everyone you were responsible for. She did not see a professional performing an ingrained safety behavior. She saw a black man in first class, watching. And something about that picture, assembled through 8 months of experience and whatever else she had brought to this job before those 8 months began, did not sit right with her. She said nothing yet. She returned to the galley and completed her pre-departure checks. She verified the cart inventory. She confirmed the beverage stock. She did all the things a flight attendant does in the 30 minutes before a door seals and a plane pushes back. But she kept her eye on 3A. And when Marcus Vance, 40 minutes into the boarding process, turned briefly in his seat to check the overhead bin, because the passenger who had boarded after him had reshuffled the contents without asking, Ashley Pruitt logged it, added it to the list she was already building in her head, a list constructed entirely from ordinary behaviors, reframed as evidence of something she had not yet named, but was already certain of. The aircraft finished boarding. The doors sealed. The safety demonstration ran. Continental Meridian Flight 1147 pushed back from Gate 14B into a flat, gray Chicago morning with 212 passengers, a crew of 6, 34,000 pounds of fuel, and a problem that was entirely of one crew member's making, though nobody on that plane except Ashley Pruitt understood that yet. The route to Dulles was scheduled for 1 hour and 48 minutes. They reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Ashley Pruitt took the drink cart into first class and worked her way down the short aisle with practiced efficiency. Sparkling waters, ginger ales, mixed nuts in small foil packets, dispensed with the smooth speed of someone whose hands have done this enough times to operate independent of conscious thought. When she reached 3A, she stopped the cart. She looked at Marcus Vance with an expression that occupied the narrow, uncomfortable zone between professional warmth and something several degrees colder, and she asked him, with the full texture of airline hospitality in her voice, if he was enjoying his flight. He looked up from the book. He said yes. He said it the way a man says yes when he means it completely and has nothing further to add, when the question has been answered in full and there is no ambiguity requiring elaboration. She held eye contact for a moment longer than the exchange required. Then she moved on. She did not return to the galley. She drifted to the partition curtain separating first class from economy, positioning herself at an angle that gave her a partial sightline to seat 3A, and she watched him from there. He read. He finished his water. He looked out the window once, briefly, the way a person does when their eyes need a rest from a page. He did not speak to the passenger beside him. He did not use the call button. He did not shift in his seat with restlessness, or stand to use the lavatory, or make any of the small ambient movements that fill a cabin over 90 minutes in the air. He sat with the total deliberate economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent years in confined spaces where unnecessary motion has costs. To Ashley Pruitt, positioned at the curtain with her arms folded across her chest, that stillness was not a neutral observation. It was, in her reading of it, the most suspicious thing in the room. She walked to the galley and picked up the interphone. She called Donna Reyes, the senior flight attendant, who was working the rear of the aircraft. Donna had been with Continental Meridian for 12 years. She had the earned patience of someone who has seen most things, and developed the ability to distinguish quickly between the things that require action and the things that require only time. Ashley told her there was a passenger in 3A she was concerned about. She said he had been watching the crew since boarding. She said his behavior was making her uncomfortable, and she wanted the senior crew to be aware. Donna asked if there had been an incident. Ashley said no, not yet. Donna asked if the passenger had said or done anything threatening or aggressive. Ashley paused before she answered. She said no, but that she could tell. Donna Reyes, 12 years in, told her to document her observations in the incident log and continue with service. She said to notify her immediately if anything actually occurred. She did not escalate it to the cockpit. She had no reason to. Nothing had happened. Ashley set down the interphone. She stood in the galley with her hand on the counter. She stood there for 35 seconds. Long enough for whatever she was thinking to become whatever she had decided. And then she walked back into the first-class cabin and approached seat 3A. She stood in the aisle. She held her tablet against her chest. She put the full weight of her professional manner into her voice and told Marcus Vance that there appeared to have been a ticketing error with his seat. She told him that 3A had been double-booked and that she was going to need to relocate him to the economy cabin for the remainder of the flight. She said it with the smooth, practiced warmth of airline customer service. The tone specifically engineered to make a demand feel like a regrettable inconvenience being managed on the passenger's behalf. Marcus Vance closed his book. He had been through the Navy's Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape program. He had sat across tables from trained interrogators, whose entire professional purpose was to dismantle the psychological composure of special operations personnel under conditions of simulated captivity. He had operated in 4 countries where the wrong facial expression at the wrong moment was not an embarrassment, but a security failure with lethal implications. He understood how to be in a room where someone had all the apparent power and he had none. And he understood, completely, from deep muscle memory, that the worst thing you can do in that room is react. He asked her, calmly, if she could show him the documentation for the double booking. He said his boarding pass showed seat 3A. His travel orders showed seat 3A. He was not aware of an error, and he was happy to look at whatever record she had that indicated otherwise. Ashley told him she understood his frustration and repeated that she needed him to relocate. Vance set the book on the tray table. He looked at her with the level, unhurried attention of a man being very precise about how he is choosing to present himself. He said he would like to speak with her supervisor before he moved. He said it without heat, without challenge. He said it the way a person says it when they have read the procedure manual and know that requesting a supervisor is the correct, documented, by-the-book response to a crew instruction you believe is in error. He was not making a scene. He was following procedure. That distinction mattered, and the camera mounted at the forward bulkhead recorded it with complete indifference to what anyone in that cabin believed. Ashley Pruitt turned and walked back to the galley. She did not call Donna Reyes. She did not page the senior crew. She bypassed every intermediate step in the chain of escalation and picked up the interphone directly to the cockpit. What she told Captain David Ferraro in the next 90 seconds was not what had happened. It was a version of events assembled from the language of aviation security protocol, selected and arranged with the specific knowledge of which words would activate a captain's duty of care response before his skepticism had time to form. She said the passenger in 3A had refused to comply with crew instructions. She said he was becoming agitated and erratic. She said he had made threatening gestures toward her and that she felt personally unsafe. She used the word aggressive. She used the word escalating. She said she feared for her safety. And then, in the final seconds of the call, she said the thing that crossed the line between poor judgment and deliberate deception. She told the captain that the passenger had raised his voice at her. He had not raised his voice. Not a single time. And not even close to it. The interphone in the galley did not pick up ambient cabin audio. The captain had no way of verifying the claim at the moment. And Ashley Pruitt knew both of those things. She set down the interphone. She straightened her jacket. She walked back into the cabin and resumed service as if the call had never happened. In the cockpit, Captain Ferraro, 22 years of service, an impeccable safety record, a man whose professional reputation was built on exactness and care, made the decision that would mark the end of the career he had built. He did not ask Donna Reyes what she had observed from 12 years of reading passengers. He did not pull the booking record for seat 3A, which would have shown, in the third field of the reservation data, a Department of Defense travel account number. He did not ask either of the two federal air marshals traveling as passengers to move forward and observe the situation before escalating. He trusted a crew member's report, and in doing so, he triggered a chain of events that no amount of good intentions would be able to stop once it started moving. He contacted Dulles Ground Operations and reported a disruptive passenger in seat 3A. He requested security to meet the aircraft. The two federal air marshals aboard were quietly informed of the situation and asked to prepare to assist. The word disruptive had entered the official record, attached to a man who had not disrupted a single thing. They did not wait for the aircraft to land. 45 minutes out from Dulles, over the low gray farmland of western Pennsylvania, the two marshals moved up through the economy cabin toward first class. They moved without announcement, without spectacle, with the clipped efficiency of people who are very good at their jobs and who had been given a report they had no reason to question. They stopped at row 3. One of them leaned to Vance's level and spoke quietly enough that the surrounding rows could only catch the shape of the exchange, not its content. He said, "Sir, we need you to come with us." Marcus Vance looked at the badge. He looked at the second marshal positioned at the aisle's edge in a way that was not accidental. He looked at the 40 or so passengers in the first class and forward economy rows who were beginning to look up from their phones and their laptops and their in-flight movies and understand that something was happening. And in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, he ran the calculation that his training had prepared him for. The one that assessed the geometry of the room, the location of every advantage and every liability, the ratio of what resistance would cost to what compliance would preserve. And he arrived at the conclusion that his entire career had been training him toward. He closed the book. He set it on the seat. He stood up slowly, hands open and visible at his sides, and he said, in a voice low enough that only the marshal directly in front of him could hear it clearly, "I want you to know that I have not done anything." He said it without anger, without performance. He said it the way a man says it, when he knows there is a camera recording this moment, and he wants the record to show what his first words were. The marshal told him to put his hands behind his back. He did. The restraints went on in front of 212 passengers, somewhere over Pennsylvania. The man in 3B looked at the window. The woman in 2C pressed herself against the armrest. A child in the 5th row asked her father a question he answered in a whisper. And at the forward galley curtain, with one hand holding the fabric open at the edge, Ashley Pruitt stood with her arms crossed and watched Marcus Vance walk down the aisle toward the rear of the plane. Gerald Okafor was a civil rights attorney from Columbus, Ohio, seated across the aisle in 3C. He had been watching since the initial approach to the seat, since the drink cart conversation that was not quite a conversation, since the interphone call Ashley had made without attempting any discretion about the fact that she was making it. He had the particular professional training that allows a person to observe a sequence of events and understand its implications in real time, without waiting for the outcome to confirm what the pattern already suggests. He watched Ashley Pruitt's face as the marshals walked her problem out of first class. He would later describe, in a written statement that ran to 6 pages, and that he submitted voluntarily to the NCIS investigation, the expression on her face at that moment. He did not use the word satisfaction. He used the word relief. He said it looked like someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular thing to happen, and was watching it happen, and was glad. The plane continued south and east. Marcus Vance sat in the rear jump seat of the aircraft with his hands bound behind him and the duffel in the overhead bin above him, and he said almost nothing. When the marshals asked him direct questions, he gave direct answers. His name, his citizenship, whether he was traveling alone. Beyond those confirmations, he offered nothing, no explanation, no appeal. No version of the "this is who I am" that he could see had no chance of landing correctly in this particular moment. He had learned in environments considerably more hostile than a commercial aircraft over Pennsylvania that words spent on the wrong audience in the wrong moment are not just wasted, they actively cost you. The time for words was not now. The plane landed at Dulles at 11:47 in the morning. It taxied to the gate. The seatbelt sign chimed off. The jetway connected. And for the next 20 minutes, as every other passenger on Continental Meridian Flight 1147 gathered their bags and deplaned, Marcus Vance sat in the rear of the empty cabin and listened to 212 people walk past him. Some looked, most did not. A few slowed down near the rear curtain, but moved on without doing whatever they had considered doing. Gerald Okafor, when he passed, stopped for a moment beside the jump seat and said, quietly, "I'm sorry, man." Vance looked at him, nodded once. Okafor walked off the plane. 2 airport police officers boarded when the cabin was empty. Professional. Measured. They did their jobs the way all the people in this story who were not Ashley Pruitt did their jobs. Competently. In good faith. Acting on information they had been given that happened to be entirely false. They led Vance off the aircraft, through the jetway, down a service corridor with no windows and no public access, and into a holding room on the secure side of the terminal. Fluorescent lights. A table. 3 chairs. A wall-mounted camera with a red recording light blinking steadily in the upper corner. They set the duffel on the table. They told him they needed to ask him some questions. Vance looked at the camera. He looked at the duffel sitting 18 inches in front of him. He looked at the 2 officers, who were both younger than him, both doing their jobs, both without any awareness of what was inside the bag on the table. He asked if he was under arrest. They told him he was being detained for questioning. He said he understood that, and that he would not be answering any questions until he had access to a JAG officer. He said it without confrontation, without defiance performed for anyone's benefit. He said it the way a man states a position he has already reasoned through and does not intend to be moved from. They said that was not how the process worked. He said respectfully and without elaboration that it was exactly how the process worked for him, and that he was prepared to wait for as long as was necessary. And then Marcus Vance, Senior Chief United States Navy SEAL, folded his hands on the table and went quiet. Not the quiet of someone who has surrendered, the quiet of someone who understands the room he is in and has correctly identified the single most effective strategy available to him inside it. SARA training does not only teach a person how to survive physical hardship. It teaches a specific, difficult, underappreciated skill: how to sit in a room where the institutional power is entirely aligned against you, where no one in the room believes you, where every impulse in your body is telling you to stand up and make them understand, and to resist that impulse completely, because you know that the fight is never the room. The fight is what comes after the room. The room is just the part you have to survive. He sat for 4 hours and 11 minutes. An officer brought him water at the 45-minute mark, with the slightly averted eye contact of someone who feels marginally uncomfortable about their role in the situation. He was checked on twice more. Both times he confirmed he was fine. He said nothing beyond that. Outside the room, he had no way of knowing that the machinery had already begun to move. But it had. The passenger manifest for Continental Meridian Flight 1147 had cleared, as all manifests do, through an automated Homeland Security cross-reference system that flags booking origin codes when they appear in security incident reports. The booking for Seat 3A was not personal. It was not corporate. It carried the identifier code of a Department of Defense travel authorization account, and that code, appearing in a security incident report, was specific enough to generate an automatic notification to a duty desk at the Pentagon. Automatic, without a human making a decision to flag it. The system flagged it because the system was designed to flag exactly this. The notification arrived at 1:15 in the afternoon. By 1:30, someone at that desk had made a phone call. By 2 o'clock, a second call had been made from a different office. By 2:20, the holding room door opened. The man who entered was not in a uniform. He wore a suit and carried a tablet. He looked at Marcus Vance with the expression of someone who has just been handed a file and has spent the last several minutes understanding what the file contains. He asked Vance to confirm his name, his rank, and the general nature of his travel. Vance confirmed all three. The man looked at his tablet. He left the room without saying anything else. He came back 8 minutes later with 2 other people. One of them asked if they could open the duffel. Marcus Vance looked at the bag on the table. He looked at the man who had asked, and he said yes. He said it with the specific, inhabited calm of a man who has been sitting in a room for 4 hours waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. The zipper came back. On top, a gray folder sealed with a red evidence tape strip and a Department of Defense embossing the travel authorization and classified document pouch from Stuttgart. Beneath it, wrapped inside a dry cleaning bag and pressed with the kind of precision that only comes from years of caring deeply about how a uniform looks, a set of navy dress blues. And pinned to the left breast of the jacket, sitting in a small hinged case lined with black velvet, unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at, the Naval Special Warfare insignia. The SEAL Trident. The device that fewer than 10,000 people in the entire history of the United States military have ever earned the right to wear. The room went quiet, not the polite ambient quiet of a room where people are choosing not to speak. The sudden, total quiet of people who have just understood something that restructures everything they thought they knew about the last 4.5 hours. The suit looked at the folder. He looked at the uniform. He looked at the trident in its case. And then he looked at Marcus Vance, who was sitting in exactly the same position he had been in when they entered. Hands folded on the table, expression unchanged, as if he had simply been waiting for this particular moment to arrive and had no particular feelings about the fact that it had taken this long. The suit turned to the officer by the door and said something quiet. The officer left immediately. The man turned back to Vance. The expression on his face was the first unmanaged expression Vance had seen since stepping off the plane. Not practiced, not controlled, not professionally calibrated. It was the look of a person who understands that something has gone very wrong, that the wrongness is fully documented, and that the consequences of that wrongness are going to be significant, traceable, and entirely unavoidable. 90 minutes later, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service had a file open. The Department of Defense had issued a formal written notice to Continental Meridian Airlines corporate headquarters, a notice demanding the full identity of all personnel involved in the decision to remove and restrain the traveler, complete recordings and transcripts of all cockpit and cabin interphone communications from the duration of Flight 1147, and a preservation hold on every piece of documentation related to the incident. The notice used language that the airline's legal team would later describe as unambiguous: federal asset, official orders, unlawful restraint, formal demand for full compliance and preservation of all records pending investigation. At 3:42 in the afternoon, the holding room door opened for the last time. An officer set the duffel in front of Marcus Vance. Another held the door. No charges, no citation, no forms to sign, because there was no legal basis on which any paperwork could be generated. He picked up the bag, slung it over his shoulder, walked down the service corridor, and came out on the public side of the terminal. He stood by a window looking out at the tarmac. He watched a Continental Meridian aircraft push back from a gate below him. He made 3 calls, his JAG contact first, his commanding officer second, his attorney third. He was not operating on anger, not on the hot, reactive frequency that the last several hours might reasonably have produced in almost anyone else. He was operating on intention. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He just needed to make sure it was done correctly. The footage request from NCIS reached Continental Meridian's Security Operations Office inside 24 hours. O'Hare's Gate 14B is covered by 7 separate cameras, maintained by 3 different entities: the Airport Authority, the TSA, and the airline itself. The aircraft's cabin camera system provided 3 angles inside the passenger compartment. Dulles has 11 cameras in the arrival's secure corridor alone. In the layered, redundant security architecture of a post-9/11 American airport, it is essentially impossible to move from a boarding gate to a federal holding room without being recorded, from multiple simultaneous angles, for the entire journey. The footage was pulled. It was logged. It was reviewed, at first by airline security personnel, then by NCIS investigators, then by the attorneys on both sides, and then, after a court order was obtained 14 days into the case by a third-party forensic video analyst retained by Vance's legal team. What it showed required no interpretation. It did not depend on the credibility of any witness. It did not require the viewer to weigh competing accounts or assess the relative reliability of individuals who contradicted each other. It was recorded by machines with no stake in the outcome, and it showed, in sequence, with timestamps, every single thing that had actually happened, from the moment Marcus Vance stepped into the priority boarding queue to the moment he was walked through the cabin door. A man boarding quietly, stowing a bag, sitting down, opening a book. A flight attendant watched him from across the cabin, repeatedly, with attention that the cabin camera captured clearly and without ambiguity. The flight attendant approached his seat, speaking briefly, moving away. The man in 3A returning to his book. The flight attendant entered the galley and made 2 separate interphone calls with no visible incident occurring in the cabin between them. And then, the frame that NCIS investigators flagged in their internal review notes as particularly significant, the moment the restraints went on. Because in that frame, caught by the forward bulkhead camera at 11:02 in the morning somewhere over Pennsylvania, was Ashley Pruitt, standing at the partition curtain, arms crossed over her chest, and on her face, in clear and unambiguous high-definition footage, an expression that no subsequent statement or legal argument would adequately account for. Gerald Okafor had called it relief. NCIS investigators, reviewing the frame multiple times with the audio stripped away, reached for a different word. Not relief, not satisfied. They wrote, in their internal notes, the word confirmation. The look of someone watching an outcome they had worked toward arrived on schedule, exactly as intended. Her attorney would argue, in written filings to 3 separate legal bodies over the course of 14 months, that facial expressions captured on video are not evidence of intent, that emotional responses are involuntary, and that an expression of relief upon the conclusion of a stressful safety incident is not indicative of malicious motivation. Those arguments were made formally and competently. They were not persuasive to any of the 3 bodies that reviewed them. The passenger video arrived before the official footage did. Gerald Okafor had not been recording. He was too experienced to make that kind of mistake. But a woman seated 4 rows back in the economy cabin had been recording a voice message to send to her daughter when the plane landed, and her phone, propped against the seat pocket in front of her, had captured the rear cabin view through the curtain gap as the marshals walked Marcus Vance through. The footage was shaky, partial. You could not see his face, but you could see Ashley Pruitt at the galley doorway, clearly, watching. And the angle gave the camera something the official cabin footage had only partially captured, a full, unobstructed view of her expression in that moment. The woman uploaded it at 4:18 in the afternoon, 22 minutes after Vance walked out of the holding room. By midnight it had been viewed 400,000 times. By the following morning, 1.5 million. By the end of the week, enough times that Continental Meridian's communications department, which had issued one holding statement about their commitment to reviewing all aspects of the incident, issued 2 more, each one slightly more specific than the last. Each one drafted in the language of an organization that understands it is losing the information battle and is adjusting its position accordingly. The legal architecture assembled around the case was built with the same methodical, sequenced precision Vance had brought to every significant operation of his career. His lead attorney, Reginald Bates, a former JAG officer with 2 decades of military civil rights experience, filed the first action 72 hours after the incident. A federal civil rights complaint under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, alleging racially discriminatory enforcement and unlawful detention under color of authority. Named as respondents, Ashley Pruitt, Captain David Ferraro in his supervisory capacity, and Continental Meridian Airlines as the entity whose policies and training failures had created the conditions for both. 10 days later, a second action, a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation, citing the airline's failure to verify government travel documentation before initiating a security removal, and its violation of federal regulations governing the handling of passengers traveling on official DoD orders. The regulations are specific. They are not ambiguous. The airline's legal team was aware of them. Whether Ashley Pruitt had been trained on them was a question that would become central to the proceeding, and that the airline would spend considerable resources attempting to answer in a way that reduced their exposure. The third action came not from Vance's team, but from the Department of Defense directly. A formal suspension of Continental Meridian's government travel contract, pending the outcome of a compliance investigation. No press release, no announcement. The contract simply stopped. The airline's Government Accounts Division, which managed bookings for federal employees across 17 agencies, received a notification letter. The revenue associated with that contract did not appear in the following month's billing cycle, or the one after. That absence, quiet and administrative and completely invisible to the public, cost the airline more in the first 90 days than any individual lawsuit could have in the same period. Ashley Pruitt was placed on administrative leave the morning after the passenger video went viral. Her supervisor, the operations manager who had received her escalation and failed to perform any verification before the situation reached the cockpit, was reassigned to a non-supervisory role pending internal review. Captain David Ferraro was removed from active flight status while the airline conducted its own investigation. He had not lied. He had not acted with malice. He had made a procedural decision in good faith based on a crew member's report, and that decision, the failure to verify, the failure to cross-reference, the failure to use the 20 seconds it would have taken to pull the manifest and see the 3-letter DoD code in the booking field, was the specific, documented, indefensible dereliction that the airline's own operating manual would be used against him to demonstrate. Continental Meridian Airlines settled 14 months after the incident. 3 separate legal actions, consolidated by agreement between the parties into a single resolution. The total figure was $6.5 million. The settlement was not sealed. That was a condition Vance's legal team had required, and that the airline, after months of negotiation, had accepted, because the alternative was a trial that would generate more coverage than the settlement, and by that point the airline had calculated, correctly, that they had no version of a trial they could survive without damage that exceeded the cost of the agreement. The public acknowledgement was required by the terms, not a statement of regret for the inconvenience. A formal, specific acknowledgement that the removal of Senior Chief Marcus Vance from Continental Meridian Flight 1147 was carried out without factual justification, that the crew report that initiated it was demonstrably inaccurate, and that the airline accepted full institutional responsibility for the harm the incident caused. Ashley Pruitt's employment had been terminated 9 months before the settlement was reached. She was not criminally charged. The evidentiary threshold for criminal liability in a case arising from an airline security report is high, and her attorney had argued successfully that whatever her motivations, she had technically operated within the procedural authority available to a cabin crew member reporting a perceived threat. That argument kept her out of a criminal proceeding. It did not keep her employed. The footage accomplished that on its own, and the footage had no defense attorney. Captain Ferraro accepted an early retirement package from Continental Meridian 8 months after the incident. He submitted a private written apology to Marcus Vance through the formal channel of their respective legal representatives. Vance's attorney confirmed the letter had been received. She did not disclose its contents. Vance did not make a public statement about it. $2 million of the settlement was directed, within 4 months of the agreement, to the establishment of a nonprofit veteran legal defense fund, an organization specifically designed to provide immediate, qualified legal representation to active duty and veteran service members who encounter civil rights violations in civilian settings. The fund was operational within 4 months of receiving the initial capital. By the end of its first calendar year, it had opened 14 cases. The fund's founding documents list its mission in one sentence: to ensure that no service member is left alone in a room without a lawyer because they happen to be traveling without their uniform. The remaining settlement terms required Continental Meridian Airlines to develop, validate, and deploy a mandatory training module for all 6,000 active cabin crew members, covering the legal standing of government travel documents, the verification requirements that apply before initiating a security removal of a DoD-booked passenger, and the specific civil and federal liability that attaches to a crew member who files a security report that is subsequently shown to be false. The module was required to be completed by every active crew member within 12 months of the settlement date, with annual refresher certification thereafter. It was named, by agreement and by Vance's specific request, after the date of Flight 1147. Not after him. He had not asked for that. He had asked only for the date, because he wanted every flight attendant who sat through that module, every crew member who watched the scenario unfold on their screen in a break room or a hotel room or a training facility somewhere, to know exactly when it happened. Not as a distant cautionary fable from somebody else's time. As a specific Tuesday morning on a specific aircraft, out of a specific gate at O'Hare, a morning that began with a man sitting quietly in seat 3A with a worn paperback, going home. Marcus Vance returned to active duty 6 weeks after the incident. He completed 2 additional deployments before retiring with full honors the following year. At his retirement ceremony, held at the Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, his commanding officer described him as the definition of the quiet professional. A man who brought to the most difficult moments of his personal life the same precision and discipline he had brought to 16 years of service, in conditions that most people will never encounter and cannot fully imagine. The Bronze Stars were already on the record. What had happened on Flight 1147 was not mentioned in the retirement citation. It didn't need to be. He had walked onto that aircraft as a passenger with a ticket, a book, and a duffel bag. He had been treated as a threat because of what someone decided he looked like when he sat still in first class. He had been cuffed in front of a full cabin, walked off a plane, and locked in a room for 4 hours and 11 minutes, and in all of that time, through all of it, he had not raised his voice. Not once. He had not fought. He had not argued. He had not performed his record, or his rank, or his credentials for anyone who did not have the standing to receive them. He had sat at a table with his hands folded and waited for the room to turn, because he knew that it would. Because the evidence was in the bag on the table, and the cameras had already captured everything that mattered, and because the most effective weapon he had was not the trident in the velvet case or the bronze stars in the DoD file. It was his composure, the specific, hard-earned discipline that understands the difference between the room and the fight, that knows the room is just the part you survive, that the fight, the real fight, the one with lasting consequence, is what you build after you walk out the door. Ashley Pruitt had stood at that galley curtain with her arms crossed, and watched what she believed was the conclusion of a problem she had solved. She had engineered a particular outcome, watched it arrive, and had no way of knowing that the moment she was observing was not an ending. It was the beginning of everything that came after, and everything that came after was exactly what she had set in motion. She had picked the wrong target, not because of his rank, though people remember the rank, not because of his record, though the record is remarkable, but because she had picked a man who understood, with the particular clarity that comes from a career spent operating in high-stakes environments, that power and correctness are not the same thing, and that correctness, pursued with patience and discipline, is the only thing that ultimately wins. She had looked at a man sitting quietly in seat 3A and decided, on the basis of what she felt rather than what she saw, that he did not belong there. She had used every tool available to her to remove him from that space, and in doing so, she had handed him something she never intended to give, a perfectly documented, fully recorded, unambiguous case that a jury would not have needed 3 hours to understand. He had wanted a quiet flight home. He got something more durable than that. He got the kind of accountability that outlasts the moment, that writes itself into training modules and legal precedents, and the institutional memory of an airline that will be doing advanced date refresher certifications long after everyone directly involved has moved on. He got the record corrected. He got the room to turn. He had always known it would. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in when an institution realizes it has made an error from which there is no clean exit, only varying degrees of exposure depending on how it responds. Continental Meridian's executive team understood this within 72 hours of the incident, when the first NCIS inquiry arrived and the government travel contract suspension followed 48 hours behind it. The press inquiries came the same week, polite at first, and then less so, as the passenger video continued to accumulate views and journalists began calling the airline's public affairs office with questions that were no longer open-ended. They weren't asking what happened anymore. They had seen the footage. They were asking why. The internal review process that the airline announced publicly was real, meaning it was conducted, it produced findings, and those findings were used in the eventual legal proceedings. But it was also, like most internal reviews conducted by organizations under legal and reputational pressure simultaneously, a document shaped by the dual needs of thoroughness and self-protection. It found that Ashley Pruitt had used her crew reporting authority without following the verification steps required by the airline's own operational manual before escalating to the cockpit. It found that Captain Ferraro had failed to perform the standard cross-check of the passenger booking record before contacting ground operations. It found that Donna Reyes, the senior flight attendant, had performed her role appropriately and recommended further monitoring rather than immediate escalation, and that her guidance had been bypassed without her knowledge. The review found, in the careful language of a document written by people who knew it would be read by attorneys on multiple sides, that the incident reflected a breakdown in established crew communication protocols with consequent regulatory and legal exposure to the airline. It did not use the word racism. That word appeared in the federal civil rights complaint filed by Vance's attorney, and it appeared in approximately 11,000 social media posts per day during the peak week of coverage, and it appeared in the first paragraph of every major news story that picked up the passenger video. But it did not appear in Continental Meridian's internal review, because the airline's legal team understood that the word, written in an internal document, would function as an admission in a proceeding where the standard of liability did not require proving intent, only proving that race was a motivating factor in the differential treatment of a passenger, which the video, the pattern of Ashley Pruitt's behavior from the moment she first watched Seat 3A, were already doing without any assistance from the airline's own paperwork. What the review did produce, quietly and without public announcement, was a full accounting of the crew training records relevant to the incident. Ashley Pruitt had completed the standard bias awareness training required at onboarding. She had passed her certification. The module she had completed was, by the standard of most airline training programs at the time, unremarkable. A 2-hour online course covering basic concepts with a multiple-choice assessment at the end. It did not include scenario-based exercises. It did not include anything specific to government travel passengers or DoD booking protocols. It did not include, anywhere in its content, a clear articulation of the legal liability that attaches to a crew member who files a security report that is subsequently shown to be fabricated. It was, in short, the kind of training that looks adequate in a review until the day it fails, and then looks exactly what it was. That gap, between the training that existed and the training that the situation revealed was necessary, became the foundation of the DOT complaint and the basis for the most consequential non-monetary term of the eventual settlement. The airline had a duty, the complaint argued, not only to train staff on hospitality and service, but to train them on the specific legal weight of the documents that certain passengers carry, on the verification steps required before a security escalation, and on the real and serious consequences, to the passenger, to the airline, and to the crew member personally, of getting that decision wrong. The duty existed regardless of what Ashley Pruitt had been told in a 2-hour online module at onboarding. It existed because federal regulations say it exists, and the airline's failure to fulfill it in a way that actually affected crew behavior was, the complaint established, a systemic failure rather than an individual one. Individual failures are easier for an airline to absorb. Systemic failures are what drive regulatory action, contract suspensions, and 8-figure settlement discussions. Reginald Bates, who had spent 2 decades watching institutions respond to accountability the way plants respond to light, turning toward it when there was no other option, told Marcus Vance in the weeks before the settlement was finalized that the number was not the point. He said this knowing that $6.5 million is, by any reasonable standard, a very large number. He said it because he had been in enough of these rooms to know that money, when it moves from one party to another in a case like this, is not primarily compensation. It is calibration. It is the mechanism by which an institution recalibrates the cost-benefit analysis it will perform the next time a crew member picks up an interphone to report a passenger whose stillness makes her uncomfortable. It is the number that makes the next Ashley Pruitt think twice, or makes the next captain pull up the manifest before he picks up the radio, or makes a training director at an airline look at a 2-hour online module and understand, with sudden and motivating clarity, that this is inadequate. Vance heard that. He directed the fund. He required the date on the module. He did not seek additional publicity. He gave one interview to a reporter who had covered military civil rights cases for 15 years and who asked the right questions, and in it he said something that the reporter quoted in the opening paragraph of a piece that ran in 3 publications. He said, "I wasn't treated that way because of anything I did. I was treated that way because of how I looked sitting still in a seat I'd paid for. The uniform was in the bag, but I was still the same person with or without it. And that's what the case is actually about." He said it without bitterness. The reporter noted that in the piece. He said it the way a man states an accurate thing and leaves it to do its own work in the world. The reporter published the piece on Thursday. By Sunday, it had been shared widely enough that 3 other news organizations ran follow-up stories. A veterans advocacy organization cited the case in a letter to the Senate Armed Services Committee, requesting a review of federal regulations governing the treatment of active-duty travelers on commercial carriers. 2 members of Congress mentioned the case by name in floor remarks. None of this had been orchestrated by Vance or his legal team. It simply moved the way stories move when they contain a specific, documented injustice, and a subject who refuses to be made into a caricature of his own victimhood. He had not presented himself as broken or diminished by what happened to him. He had presented himself, simply and accurately, as a man who had been wronged, who had pursued correction through the appropriate channels with the appropriate discipline, and who had gotten the outcome those channels were designed to produce. That framing, competent, contained, legally precise, made the story harder to dismiss and easier to repeat. The training module that Continental Meridian was required to build and deploy became, over the course of its development, something more serious than most mandatory compliance training. The airline retained an outside firm to develop it, partly because the internal training team was too close to the incident, and partly because the DOT oversight requirement specified third-party development as a condition of the settlement's compliance terms. The firm conducted interviews with current crew members, with legal experts in aviation and federal employment law, with military advocacy organizations, and, at Vance's attorney's suggestion, which the airline accepted, with 2 active-duty service members who had experienced similar incidents on commercial carriers that had not resulted in legal action. Their accounts formed the scenario basis for the training's case studies. The module runs 45 minutes. It is scenario-based. It includes 3 separate case studies built around the failure patterns identified in the Flight 1147 incident: a crew member escalating without verification, a supervisor failing to cross-check a booking record, A captain activating a security response based on a single crew report without corroborating observation. Each scenario shows the decision point, the incorrect choice, and then, unlike most compliance training which stops at identifying the error, it shows the downstream consequence in explicit institutional and personal terms. Legal exposure, contract suspension, the settlement figure, and then it shows the correct procedure, how to pull a manifest booking code, what a DoD account number looks like, and what it means, what verification steps are required, and in what order, what a crew member's actual legal exposure is when they file a security report that is subsequently shown to be inaccurate. The assessment at the end is not multiple choice. It requires crew members to walk through a decision sequence, in a scenario and document, in writing, the verification step they would take and why. Their responses are logged. Failure requires full module retake. It is, by the assessment of several aviation training professionals who have reviewed it at the request of the advocacy organizations following the case, among the more substantive bias and protocol training programs currently in use by a major domestic carrier. It runs every year. Every crew member, named after a date that most of them, by the time they sit down to take it, have already heard of. Marcus Vance did not attend the module's launch. He did not attend any of the proceedings that followed the settlement. He had returned to duty, completed his final deployments, and retired with the quiet, unhurried efficiency that had characterized everything he did. He shook hands at his retirement ceremony. He received his flag. He thanked the people who had served alongside him in the particular, economical way of someone who means it and doesn't need it to run long. And he went home. What he left behind was not a monument or a movement or a narrative built around his suffering. What he left behind was a legal record, a funded organization, a training module with a date for a name, and the precise, documented demonstration that the system, when pushed correctly, with patience and evidence and the right attorney, can be made to correct itself. Not perfectly, not immediately, not without cost, but it can be made to move. He had sat in seat 3A with a book and a duffel bag, and asked for nothing beyond what his ticket entitled him to. He had been given handcuffs and a holding room, and 4 hours of institutional machinery grinding against him with its full and unself-aware weight. And he had not broken, he had not bent, he had simply waited, with the specific discipline of a person who understands that the room is never the fight, for the moment the evidence was allowed to speak. It spoke. The room turned. He walked out the door. That is the whole story. That is all of it. The rest, the settlement, the module, the fund, the congressional mentions, the training firm, the third-party assessments, the reporter, and her 3 publications. All of that is of consequence. What happened was simple. A man was treated unjustly, he responded correctly, and eventually the record caught up with what had actually occurred. In a world where that outcome is not guaranteed, where the machinery fails as often as it works, where evidence is sometimes not enough, and patience is sometimes not rewarded, and the room sometimes never turns. In that world, the fact that it worked this time is not a reason for comfort. It is a reason to make it work the next time, and the time after that, and every time someone sits down in a seat they have every right to sit in, and someone else decides, on the basis of nothing observable and everything assumed, that they don't belong there. The module runs every year. The date is on the cover. That was the point. If this story moved you, don't just watch in silence. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to see what happens when racism meets accountability. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.